Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is May 29th, 2015, and my guest is Adam Davidson, co-founder of NPR's Planet Money. He writes the On Money column for the New York Times Sunday Magazine. Adam, welcome back to EconTalk.
It's really great to be here, Russ.
Our topic for today is an article you wrote recently at the Times Magazine called What Hollywood Can Teach Us About the Future of Work. It's some of the economics you learned while being a technical advisor on a Hollywood film. And I want to start by hearing more about that experience. Technical advisor to a Hollywood film sounds like a very good job, or what the Gershwins called nice work if you can get it. What was that like?
So it was absolutely awesome. It was a really fun experience, although I will say it is not a lucrative experience. I mean, it was fine. I didn't do it for free, but it was not. A friend of mine yesterday said, "Oh, is this the kind of this retirement money?" And it is definitely not something to do for the money. The technical advisor definitely makes the least amount of money on a Hollywood set, I would say. But I'm not upset because it was really, really fun. What happened was Adam McKay is a major Hollywood writer and director. He was at Second City and helped found the Upright Citizens Brigade, and then went on to be the head writer at Saturday Night Live and became a creative partner with Will Ferrell and wrote and directed the Anchorman movies, Talladega Nights, Step Brothers. But he is a guy who cares a lot about economics and economic issues, and he decided to helm the adaptation of Michael Lewis's book, The Big Short. So
former EconTalk guest, I have to get into the name dropping Hollywood thing.
Yes, former EconTalk guest and former Planet Money guest, I'll also mention. So Adam McKay was working on this script for The Big Short, and he quickly found himself struggling, as I think all of us did, with understanding what these toxic assets were that were so central to the financial crisis. He wanted to understand better the broad world of Wall Street, but also how a crisis in Wall Street could have such devastating impact on people around the country and around the world. And my brother Eben Davidson is a senior vice president at Paramount Pictures, and so he's one of the guys who is in charge of making movies at Paramount. And he was talking to Adam McKay and said, "Hey, you should talk to my brother. My brother Adam Davidson knows a lot about that stuff." And so that's how it happened. And so for over a year, Adam McKay and I would talk quite often. I mean, for hours at a time, very often, as he was writing the script. But it was when the movie actually got greenlit and started production that I really got involved, even more so.
For the non-insider, greenlit means the company approved the filming of it, right?
Yeah, I mean, that whole part of it was really interesting because, this is a movie with, it's a major motion picture starring Brad Pitt, Christian Bale, Ryan Gosling, Steve Carell. So, major motion picture.
Couldn't they get anybody good?
Yeah, I know. It was this ridiculous.
And why did they stoop so low on the technical advisor side? If they're going top shelf, what? Never mind. Go ahead. Keep going.
No, I agree. Yeah. They definitely could have. Although I will tell you, like Adam McKay did talk to a variety of economists. I'm not an economist.
But you play one on Hollywood.
Yes, and I play one on the radio and in print. But I don't want to speak for him, and I'm frankly, he'd be thrilled to be a guest on your show and would be happy to tell you himself. But I think economists are, and Russ, I would genuinely say you are an exception to this, but economists as a group are not the greatest at conveying their work in English so that people can understand it, and also not the greatest at accessing the emotional stakes of the work they do. So, a lot of our conversations were about, linking some financial product or someone's view about a financial product to an emotion, to ground it emotionally, so that he could write a scene where someone is deciding to short a collateralized debt obligation, say, and Adam really wanted to understand, what is a collateralized debt obligation? Why would someone short it? Why was that considered a strange trade in early 2006, say? And what was it like to be a person who was going against the market and having a very different view than the rest of the market? And just, we don't have to go too deep into it unless you want to, but a collateralized debt obligation, a CDO, for those who don't know, that's, when I think of toxic assets, that was the essential toxic asset. That was one of these weird derivative products based on mortgage-backed securities that were at the heart of the financial crisis. And this movie is about a handful of people who understood before others did that CDOs and other mortgage-related financial products were, a bubble or about to lose a lot of value and create a lot of havoc.
So when it came time to film the movie, how long were you on the set for? How many, was it a day, a week, a month? What were you doing?
Yeah, I was there probably a month altogether, and maybe just under a month. And I think it was about 2 months of, I think they call it principal photography. So the economics of shooting a movie that takes place entirely in New York, but shooting it in New Orleans was very interesting. That's all about tax incentives, and that's a whole conversation to have. Yeah, I think you and I would both agree that that's probably not a great use of public resources. But there it was in New Orleans, and finding those corners of New Orleans that they were able to make look like New York, or in other cases California or Florida. So that was all interesting.
But when you were on the set, were you doing things like, he wouldn't be happy when the price went down? Did you have a role, or were you just there for fun?
No. So working on the script, there was a lot of conversation about what the characters would feel, based on different market conditions. So if you try and put yourself in the shoes of, and these were real people in Michael Lewis's book, Michael Burry or Danny Moses or whoever, who were making a huge bet, staking a lot of their personal wealth and their professional reputation on betting against a product, and that product continued to rise in value despite them telling their investors, no, it's about to go down in value. What would that feel like, and what was going on there? So that was all sort of in the year before, as he's writing the script, or that was largely in the year before. Then on the set, I'd say my biggest role was working with what they call the department heads. So there's a bunch of what they call creative departments. There's the set designer who's in charge of the overall look and feel of the set, but then there's separately a set dresser who is in charge of the physical objects that are on the set that actors do not touch. And then separately, there's a prop master who is in charge of the physical objects that actors do touch. And then there's a costume designer who's obviously in charge of the costumes. And it was fascinating to me how specific and specialized these roles are. So, for example,
I have to quote Adam Smith, because his insights, I'm going to quote him later, or mention him later, but his understanding about the power of specialization to create wealth and in turn create more specialization is very this is an incredible 2015 experience, right? It's absurd how specialized things are. But go ahead.
It was amazing how specialized. Yeah, on the set there are 150 to 250 people, each of them with a very clear and understood job. And that's what struck me. I was on set the very first morning of the very first day of shooting. It's dawn, it's 6:50 or something in the morning, and it's, I think, 150 people that day who've never worked together in this configuration. Maybe some of them had known each other on other shoots, and instantly, without anyone saying anything, there's no speech, there's no meeting. It's just instantly everybody is doing their job. They're laying cables for the lights. They're setting this, they're setting that. Anyway, it was all very fascinating.
Did you want to say something about specialization? I interrupted you. Did you? Go ahead.
So you have, and it's very clear to them. It took me a long time to figure it out, but there's someone who's in charge of painted walls if they're not active in the scene, but someone else is in charge of the walls if the walls are somehow interacted with by actors. So there was a wall where someone did some drawing on. That's the prop master's work, not the set designer's work, because it involves markers, I guess, that the guy holds in his hand. I learned that watches, for example, is prop master, not costume designer.
Sure.
There's the director of photography. There's a lighting department, and what struck me was they had a relatively little bit of time before production started, where Adam McKay, the director and writer, would meet with them and set an overall tone. Adam McKay is known for these kinds of absurdist, almost cartoonish live-action comedies, and a lot of these people were people he had worked with on those, but he wanted to make clear, that is not what I'm going for. This is a very real feeling, almost documentary feeling film. There's certainly a kind of melancholy, this is a film about a financial crisis that affects real people. So Adam McKay sets an overall feel, an overall tone, but then each of the creative department heads has to interpret that in their own way. So I had a very long talk with the set designer about the particular color of off-white he used for the walls in certain offices. The costume designer would really, she was amazing, Sue Matheson. I mean, she called all the real people involved. She did enormous amounts of research to understand exactly what people wore. It was technically considered a period piece, even though the period was 2006, not that long ago.
Sure. It's a historical film.
She had to know, how were people wearing their collars way back when in 2006 on Wall Street? What kind of shirts were they wearing? And then the prop master, etc. So they were in charge of that, although they asked me, I talked to them a lot on the phone. I actually took them to a trading floor in Los Angeles and brought them on a tour of a trading floor and explained the different kinds of computer screens that would be there, the different, all the paper. There is a surprising amount of paper I find in trading floors these days, research that people get from banks or lists of prospectuses and stuff like that. So I explained all that to them. They were very fascinated. On trading floors, people always have these Lucite awards and Lucite objects that, and a lot of the discussion was how quote unquote real would this be? I mean, how documentary was it? And McKay said, I want this almost, 98, 99% real. And this was a real challenge. I mean, a bunch of the people on this film had worked on the Hunger Games. Some of them worked on the new Terminator movie. So these are people who are
different.
They can create, crazy worlds. And suddenly, there's nothing more boring than a trading floor. I mean, it's an office with desks and computer screens and mostly guys in white and blue shirts and dark slacks sitting and typing, and McKay was not going to have the fantasy that people have. There weren't going to be people standing on chairs and screaming out buy and sell orders, and he wasn't going to fake it a lot. So it was amazing to me how they were able to both be true to reality, but still somehow make it alive. And that just, I guess you need to be a genius at what kind of off-white makes a really boring office look interesting. So at first they were asking me very broad questions. Just what is this universe? They didn't know. I think a lot of them did think of, the movie Trading Places or the movie Bonfire of the Vanities, where there's people screaming and yelling and throwing things and cursing. And I dissuaded them of that. And then, but then it became very, very pragmatic. What exact documents would be on this desk and what documents would be on that desk. I was the middleman with Bloomberg because Bloomberg, everybody has Bloomberg screens who's a trader, and Bloomberg actually has a process where they create screens for movies, and I was the guy who would talk to them. Here's what this guy would have on his computer screen, but this woman would have this other chart or this other graph or whatever it might be. And in this movie, they really wanted it accurate. I mean, when the movie comes out, and hopefully you'll see it, you'll see there are offices filled with paper. I mean, just piles and piles of paper. And I'm pretty confident that all of that paper is pretty much what would have been there. So there are real prospectuses from real financial instruments. There are real reports from real banks and analysis firms. One of the actors was telling me, how cool it was to be kind of waiting between shots and just randomly picking up a piece of paper and thinking, wow, that's actually what my character would have had at his desk.
What's weird about it is there's this famous story, I forget which book it's in, doesn't matter, but it's, William Sonoma had some catalog, and on the cover of the catalog was some kind of food, let's pretend it was a pie, and they did this beautiful photo shoot of the pie, and then somebody tasted the pie and it didn't taste good. So they threw everything out. They wouldn't use any of the pictures, right? So here are these people trying to recreate something that 99.99% of the audience has no idea what it is authentic, right? But they want it to be authentic anyway, and that's interesting by itself. Given the list of people who were there and what that whole experience was like, is this the most fun you've had since getting to know about the Canes Hike rap videos? How would you rank this in terms of professional thrills? This has got to be up there. It's pretty fun.
I would say it's definitely high up there. It was really fun. And I'm not above saying that it is thrilling to sit down with Brad Pitt or Ryan Gosling or Christian Bale or Steve Carell and be tasked with explaining the financial crisis to them. That's pretty exciting. I got to admit. I'd love to say, I'm above all that, but I'm not. It was really fun. And I have to say, by the way, they were all awesome. Just honestly, humble, professional, cool, easy. I was surprised. I had in my head what a movie star might be like, and these guys they came to work. They were serious. They were brilliant. I mean, even if they weren't superstars, it would have been just a thrilling experience. Everybody involved, I have to say, were top of their game. And just everyone. I mean, these were the costume designer, I don't know. I would think I would never care about the costume designer, but she's amazing. And the thought that went into what people wore and how that conveyed the story and how that supported the mood. As I said, the set designer, the prop master, all of that was it was just cool.
Well, I will.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say what several people told me this was an unusually pleasant experience. So, and that whatever nightmare you can imagine is a very real possibility. Just an abusive director who screams and yells, actors who act like divas, a bunch of people who don't coalesce so elegantly. I mean, people told me this was an unusual experience. And part of what made it unusual, I think Adam McKay just, he's become a close friend and he's just a really good guy, but he set a tone that we are telling a real story and an important story, and that this is not just a piece of entertainment, but this is, something of a historic document, and it's important that people understand it. And I think, so I would say this was a huge outlier in the degree of respect they gave to, not just to me, but to the idea of getting it right, getting the economics right, getting the finance right. I don't think that's typical.
I'd like to volunteer to be the technical advisor to the technical advisor. If that position's available in your next gig, I hope you keep me in mind.
You would have been very helpful.
I'll take a small, very small stipend. And now, the reason I mentioned Adam Smith before, saying I would mention him again, is one of my questions, which you kind of answered, but I'm going to ask to get Smith in, is that Smith says in The Theory of Moral Sentiments, man naturally desires not only to be loved, but to be lovely. And he says there's two ways to be loved. One's to be rich, famous, and powerful, and the other is to be virtuous. And he said there's a seductive aspect to being loved in that first way. We all are attracted by wealth and by power and by money. And people who have those things, people pay attention to them. They're loved. That's what Smith means by love. They're respected, and they get a lot of when they walk in the room, heads turn. And so you were in that universe in an extraordinary way. Those names you mentioned are not just, those are real stars. Those are at the top of the top. And yet you're saying they were pretty lovely in the virtuous sense too, not just the fact that they were rich and famous and a little bit powerful.
Yeah, it felt like I remember seeing the dancer Margot Fontaine give an interview where she said she was always taught to take the work very seriously and not to take herself seriously at all. And that is definitely the experience I had. This was a group of people who felt they were doing something very important, both the story itself and adding hopefully to people's knowledge of this financial crisis, but more broadly that, embodying characters, telling an emotional story is a serious and important job. And I did not witness anybody taking themselves too seriously.
Of course, they could have been acting.
They could have been acting, yeah. And I should say, my dad's an actor. My dad's not a famous actor. He's a solid, journeyman actor. And so I grew up surrounded by actors, and I would say, but I would say that is my general experience of actors. I mean, that there certainly might be a little, broadly speaking, there might be a touch more narcissism than there is in the general public, and there's certainly, there certainly have been divas I've met in my life, but I think people take it pretty seriously, and certainly that's what I saw on this production.
It's incredibly fun. Anything? Before we move on to the quote economics, the less glamorous part of this episode, is there any story you want to share with us that you can share? I know you can't tell everything that happened on the set. You're under all kinds of confidentiality and non-disclosure agreements. Do you have anything you can share that's G-rated for our audience that might amuse?
Here's the constraint, and this was something that I was mindful of, and it is an economic lesson. So one thing that I have thought about celebrity in general and is when you are a significant celebrity, there is an orbit around you. There's a world of people whose lives, whose income depends on you, and it's ecosystem after ecosystem. You have your own people, your manager, your agent, maybe a producer, a film company. Then you have these other people, paparazzi and gossip columnists and others that feed off of that fame. And the end result is that anything I might say about any one of these celebrities suddenly has this economic value in the world and can be distorted and misused, etc. I honestly have nothing negative. I have nothing salacious, but I have some nice stories of having nice times with really pleasant people, and they're nice stories, but I don't want to tell them because it's
okay, Adam. I'll just tell my kids I talked to somebody who was hanging out with Christian Bale. They'll be very excited.
Okay.
They're big fans of Christopher Nolan, and they just that's great. Let's move on.
All right, here's just a quick. We just had this funny moment when my son, who's 3, always wears some Superman costume on set, and he happened to be wearing his Captain America outfit when he met Christian Bale, and it was normally he wears his Batman outfit, and we were going to explain to him like that's Batman, but then I realized that to a 3-year-old that literally means nothing. Like he's an he's the actor who played.
And if it means something, it's probably years of therapy ahead of him to cope with that at 3. I mean, he's not ready to. It's too intense.
Right, exactly. Although I will say, my son, after spending, he probably spent a few hours, several days in a row on the set. And again, this is a movie about people sitting in offices talking about financial products. And it's a great, great movie, by the way.
I'm sure. But,
but for a 3-year-old. And so one day we were getting ready to go to the set, and he said, "Can we go to a set where they make movies I like to watch?"
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So let's get to the economics that you wrote about in the piece. Thanks for all that. That was fascinating and a lot of fun. But you took this time and made a set of observations, this experience, and made some more general observations, partly about Hollywood, but also about the wider economy. And in particular, you are going to riff off this observation that here are these hundreds of people who just spring into action on day one, and when the lights go out, when the set is taken down, they're scattered to the winds. They're not part of a company. They're all freelancers brought together for this experience, and you call that the Hollywood model. So talk about what you saw that made you think about that.
So I've been thinking a lot because I'm writing a book, which will not be out till next year, and I will definitely be calling you repeatedly to be a guest on EconTalk about that.
I'll think about it.
But it's a book that tries to explore how work will happen in the 21st century. And I've been thinking a great deal about how work happened in the 20th century. And like you, Ronald Coase, the crucial University of Chicago economist, has
and LSE,
played
even though I have a Chicago PhD.
Right, yes, and LSE.
Some of the work we're talking about at the LSE, so I think.
Right.
I think it's the LSE.
Yeah, it's an incredible story, by the way. So he asked and answered one of the fundamental questions, I would say, of the 20th century, and which is very much on my mind. And he did it at 20. It really is an incredible story. He was a college kid studying economics in England. I don't think he was at LSE yet, although I'm not sure about that.
I'll do some Googling while you talk. Go ahead.
Yeah. And he got this grant or this research project to travel around the U.S. and look at American businesses. And I believe this is 1930. He's 20 years old. And he asks this incredibly simple question. And I know you have talked about this on EconTalk.
Many times.
And so many times. So we don't have to go too far down that road. But basically noticed, hey, wait a second, we're taught this Adam Smithian world of markets continuously adjusting using the price signal to match supply and demand. Why is the major thrust of business in America these large corporations where the market signal is completely blunted, where people
it's command and control.
Where it's command and control, and in the context of the Hollywood model, the average worker is not given signals about their market value. You get a job, you work in, and this is, I'm now spinning off of Coase. I mean, this is in my mind embedded in Coase, but it wasn't explicit in his paper, The Theory of the Firm. But embedded in Coase is this idea that the average worker, a person with a salary job, is not receiving a lot of information from the market. They get a job for a certain task, and they have that job maybe for decades. And in that time, they're not given the opportunity or the pain of learning what their market price is. And for someone, much of the middle part of the 20th century, this was a pretty good deal for an awful lot of people. We have the great wage compression, and people who are kind of sheltered from those market signals did fairly well. There's a whole conversation to have about efficiency wages and on about, but broadly speaking, it wasn't, for people who got those jobs, it was not a bad thing to be shielded from the market.
And to have a long-term relationship with one employer who you would invest, both sides could invest in the other and get better at the job, and the worker could acquire skills that the firm would find useful. And there's some romance about long-term employment in the United States, and how long-term it was in the 20th century. But on average, I think the model that you're talking about that you saw is clearly not that model.
Right. So my argument would be that for a whole host of reasons, that Coasean, and it's not Coasean, it's not like he was for it, he was just observing it, but that kind of classic Coasean or also Alfred Chandler, the the great Harvard business historian, describes this also, that kind of Chandlerian firm where there's, thousands of people protected from market signals, that because of trade, because of technology, that is less and less the case. I'm not making some absolute claim that that's going away forever, but more and more people are finding that the market is signaling them continuously. I see this in my field, in journalism. I mean, when I joined public radio in the 1990s, it was already, even though it was, NPR was only, 22 years old at that point, it was already well established as a solid union job where you could make a solid low six figures income, and very few people lost the job. Very few people made more than that. It was just a very predictable, solid career with very little market signal. And I would say today in journalism, I have friends who have lost enormously. They've lost their jobs. They've had probably a permanent wage shock. And then I have other friends who are multimillionaires who've made a fortune because of shifts in the marketplace that they've taken advantage of. And so what the Hollywood model, one of the salient facts in my mind was that all of these various workers, the creative department heads, the actors, the writer and director, even the technical folks, the electricians, the carpenters, they live in a world where they receive a market signal all of the time. That their life is broken up into these projects. This one was 2 months. Some bigger movies like the Hunger Game movies, that might be a year and a half. I think, there are, the big franchises like the Hobbit movies, you might get a job for 3 or 4 years.
Right. And
but
because
for the most
sequels,
Yeah, but for the most part, you're talking about people who 2 or 3 or 4 times a year are directly receiving market information about their value. They're negotiating their wages movie by movie. And they're also receiving continuous information from the market because it's a very networked world, and they're learning who else is getting hired and who else, and getting a sense of how much money other people are getting paid. So just as one example that I found really funny was Julie Hewitt, who was the head of makeup for the film, and was telling me that there's been this explosion in zombie makeup over the last few years. There's The Walking Dead and all these zombie ripoff stuff. And she said that's not a specialty of hers. She's not particularly interested or experienced in zombie makeup, but that she had some friends who really knew how to make a living person look like a dead person seeking to eat brains. And that went from a very obscure skill with little market demand to an extremely in-demand skill with very limited market demand. And with very extreme market demand. The demand far exceeded the supply. And so she was telling me her friends were doing great. There were all these people taking classes on how to do zombie makeup. But that kind of signal is happening continuously. Yes. And it's happening on many dimensions. It's happening because of taste. So there's no way to predict 20 years ago that, zombies would become really hot. And so there's no way to tell someone in, 1997, like, oh boy, you should really go to zombie makeup school. So there's just kind of taste. There's also technology. As camera technology changes, it dramatically shifts the kinds of jobs. Because, and I had a long talk with the director of photography, this brilliant guy, Barry Ackroyd. He did United 93 and Captain Phillips and a ton of other great movies. And he was telling me, there's a whole job called the focus puller, somebody who just, there's the director of photography setting the overall look of the photography. Then there's a cameraman actually operating the camera. And then there's someone who puts the camera into focus. So there's a focus puller. And that focus puller job is being threatened because there's new technology that allows focusing to be done more quickly. And in my mind, for the highly skilled people who I was meeting, this is a much better deal than the Coasian, Chandlerian world we described. That these were people at the top of their game. They were receiving continual signals telling them what skills they needed to refresh, what skills were no longer valuable and needed to be replaced. And as time went on, they were able to establish a kind of reputational value so that that was something else I learned, that in this world where you need a team to come together very quickly and work well together, not being a jerk is a hugely valuable thing.
I think of the Hayekian role of prices to convey information that you're talking about. It's really a incredibly dramatic part of it, but there's also this, what Hayek called the particular knowledge of particular circumstances, I think, of time and place. And it would seem to me that there must be certain directors who have certain styles and certain tastes. Obviously, many of them will use the same actors, and I assume they use the same cinematographers, but those are at the highest end. But throughout that whole chain of cooperation, the hundreds of other people you're talking about, they have to have some feel, or at least the flexibility to adapt to the tastes of a particular director or the kind of movie that's being made. And they have to draw on their past experience or, again, their ability to adapt to it, because that image that you conveyed as, it's sunrise, it's dawn on day one, and all of a sudden this beehive, almost literally, because it's this decentralized beehive, the director is not sitting in that 1940s chair bossing people around. The director might, for a certain scene, is going to move people over to this point or that point, but all the technical stuff that underlies that is emerging through the knowledge that the players have of how this gets done that they've had in the past. And if this current model, this current project, they're not doing a good job, they're going to pay a very high price because they're going to be less demand the next time. So it's really an amazing application of it's where Hayek and Coase come together, it seems.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a delicate ballet, because this was some advice my brother gave me early on, where he said, basically people make two mistakes. One mistake is they don't assert themselves enough, and they just, all right, I'll just support your vision, I'll just do whatever you tell me. But the director is hiring all these people to have an opinion, to have a view. And so you need to assert your view.
The director specializes. The director doesn't want to try to figure out what costume, what watch the person should be wearing. That's not useful.
Exactly. Right.
You want the time.
Yeah. Exactly. And you want a costume designer or a prop master who has strong opinions, who says, I think this really works. This is in keeping with the character. I don't agree on this thing. But at the same time, you don't want to assert it too much. And that's an incredibly delicate game, and has to adapt, because, I think Adam McKay is a fairly accessible, easy to get along with guy. Other directors are very rigid and are not at all easy to get along with. So this isn't a problem you solve once. This is a problem endemic to the field. I'd say a couple other nice features about it, and then I hope we can talk about some of the negatives to this world as well. Another feature I noticed is that it's somehow both simultaneously rewards experience and rewards professionalism, or whatever you want to call it.
Reliability.
Reliability. It's not like a cartoon version of Silicon Valley where it's just all about 24-year-olds, and as soon as you're old, you're no longer innovating. It's, when you got to do this job, and a lot of each day of shooting is hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, you want everyone to be a pro. And so you're willing to hire the 58-year-old with a proven track record, even if there's that super hot 24-year-old who you're not quite sure about yet. But that being said, there still are slots for the young people. There's a real apprenticeship program not a formal apprenticeship program, but it's very well understood that the young assistants are trying to learn and are trying to mimic and mirror the elders, and then their elders. And then also, because these movies come together so last minute and sometimes, and you just can't get your first choice. The younger people do have an opportunity, maybe not as quickly as they want it, but there's a reasonable expectation that at some point I'm going to be given my shot, that I'm going to get to be the top guy, simply because the first, second, and third choice top guys or gals weren't available, and so I'll come in. I was talking to didn't work on this movie, but another friend of mine who's a set decorator. So he picks things for the set, and he really wants to be a designer. And he just told me, I'm just waiting for that day that there's just no designers available. And then they say, all right, well, we got to give this guy a shot.
So the thing that struck me when you one of the things I thought was insightful about your piece was the idea that perhaps the last 100 years of American economic history, the corporate form and the more longer-term employment is an aberration rather than something that would persist. And thinking about it, one of the reasons it's dying, there's a lot of reasons that it's not dying, but it's less common. And one of the reasons the Hollywood model is on the rise is a Coasean reason, which is the reduction in transaction costs. And of course, Coase argued that the reason you go through this, quote, inefficient firm structure of bossing people around instead of using price signals is that it's not free to use price signals. And so what looks inefficient actually isn't. And I was thinking that when you live in a world where information and reputation is much more easily discovered, where you can hire somebody out of Seattle if you're in Florida or out of Boston if you're in L.A., who's, quote, the best person, there's got to be a much more, I'm guessing, a much more refined and knowledgeable set of – there's much more information about who can do these jobs well, so that if you said to me, in 3 months we're going to put together this team to do X, Y, and Z, that director or that producer can find those people quickly and not worry that it's going to be a disaster. Because if that weren't true, then you'd have your own in-house costume designer, your in-house, et cetera. But once it becomes relatively inexpensive, and not inexpensive, but the quality can be maintained through this more spontaneous model, you really have a much a chance for it to survive, it seems like, and to thrive.
Yeah, absolutely. And it did. One thing I kept thinking about is the economic importance of gossip. And this wasn't a gossipy set in the mean way. I mean, I know nothing about the sex lives of anybody involved or anything like that. But one thing I noticed is when you get a bunch of movie people together, it very quickly, the conversation is about other movie people. And, oh, did you hear about this guy who completely flamed out on this project? Or that woman who saved the day on this project? Or, oh, boy, you're going to work with that guy? Yeah, he's really temperamental. He's brilliant, but really temperamental. And that just was a constant thing. And my wife would, if she were here, would say that that's also true for me and my journalism friends, that we're constantly having that conversation.
Yeah, for sure.
And maybe
it's part of every workplace.
It's part of every, and in a kind of Coasean Chandlerian world where the market signal appears only occasionally, once every few years or so, that still exists. But here it has real economic force. I mean, I have to assume that if the number of people out there saying, boy, Adam Davidson's kind of a lame technical advisor, if that goes up too high, I'm not getting another job.
It's over, Adam.
Yeah, right. Although I will say, I think I was a very good technical advisor. And
that's what I hear. No, that's what I hear.
Yeah.
But I hear you needed. I heard there were times when you needed someone else to lean on, and it would have been helpful to have the technical advisor to the technical advisor. Just what I heard. I don't. I can't
Russ,
tell you where I heard that.
I brought your name up. I am very honest. This is a true story. I sent your podcast to Adam McKay and to several of the actors. I mentioned you. I really did. You're not the only economist I mentioned, but there weren't a lot.
We don't want to hear about the other ones, Adam.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah.
That's fine. Let's keep that between you and me.
Yeah.
I just want to mention we did we had an interview with Reid Hoffman and Ben Kesnoka about a year ago on their book, The Alliance, where they argue it's not the same point, but it's clearly very related, that people who work in corporations today who pretend that it's a long-term relationship. Their book is about the fact that we sort of have this lingering allure of this relationship between employer and employee that is dying. Even when you're in a corporation, they argue you should recognize it might not be for very long, and both employer and employee should be transparent about it to make that relationship work more effectively. So they're not talking about this Hollywood model, projects that start and stop over 2 to 6 or 12 months or whatever it is. They're just saying that realistically, most people don't stay on the job for a long time. So that changes all the incentives on both sides, and it would be better to talk about it openly. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually I had dinner with Reid and Ben sometime last year, and I told them that their book made me very excited because it was sort of for me, the first solution I had heard of in a corporate context that actually seemed hopeful and honest. I found it extremely exciting to, basically import the best aspects of the Hollywood model into a corporate model, and where everything is explicit. That's one thing about the Hollywood model. It's very explicit. There is no, you know exactly how valued you are in the marketplace, and and you are told that several times a year over and over again.
And that each project has a start date and a probable end date. It might drag on longer than people think, but in general, you know that you're going to be out looking for work again.
Yes, absolutely. I think where I get worried or get sad is thinking about people who don't have specialized skill, who the market is not going to be kind to year after year.
A big issue.
And I would say that, there clearly is some dividing line where above that line, this system is much better than the old system. So if you're a really great graphic designer at Procter & Gamble in 1957, you're probably making the same money as a really crappy graphic designer at Procter & Gamble in 1957. Like your skills are not being rewarded. Maybe if you're a superstar, you can stand out. But basically the 80th percentile guy is making the same as the 20th percentile guy, I would guess. And in this world, you're being priced much more according to your skills. So if you're in the 20th percentile, it's good to make 20th percentile wages. And if you're in the 80th percentile, it's bad to make 80th percentile.
You're talking about in the 1950s model.
Yeah, I'm saying the shift. So my claim would be for most of the 20th century, there's a fairly crude ranking. There's a small handful of superstars. Then there's a huge middle where everyone's basically making around the same, and it's not very precisely correlated with your particular quality or passion or skill. And now I would argue more of us are seeing our wages more directly correlated with our particular passion or skill.
But in your let's go back to the economics, because in your magazine piece, you argued that you didn't talk about the transaction cost part because that's only part of it. The other part you emphasized and focused on was the idea that the products we make are different. So when you're in a manufacturing environment, say, where you're churning out a commodity that's the same over and over again, the type of skills that are demanded, and then thereby the workforce structure and the firm structure is going to be different than today's world. So what I want to push you toward is what's changing on the output side, on the nature of work in America, that makes you think that the Hollywood model is going to be more common? And then we'll talk about who's going to have trouble fitting into that. But
sure.
Why do you argue that that's the future rather than just a quirky thing that happens in L.A.?
So the analogy or a place that I learned a lot is at this textile company in the South that I'm writing about in my book, which was very much a commodity textile producer. They just made man-made fibers for like cheap sweaters and athletic wear. And for most of the 20th century, and then that business collapsed very abruptly and they lost it all, and they've reinvented themselves as making kind of complex value-added fibers that are they're pretty cool. Resistant to stain or resistant to flaring for use in for people who work at utilities and stuff, so that if a spark happens on them, they won't burn up. Anyway, very highly technical fibers. But anyway, the point I would make is the way to get rich. If it's 1920 and you are all knowing about the next 80 years, becoming better and better at commoditizing your product, becoming better and better at making the same thing over and over again, cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, that's a great way to make a living. And that's a really smart way to make a living, certainly well into the 1970s. And that is, I would argue, the kind of core thrust of the American economy is on the production side, it's having a fairly homogeneous suite of products and focusing the bulk of your energy on getting the production cheaper, and so the prices keep falling, but your costs are hopefully falling faster than the prices are.
Competition is forcing you to innovate. It's forcing you to pass most, if not all, those savings on to the customer, and you're on this constant treadmill. I think of it as the Walmart model. You find ways to lower and control your inventory so that you can sell the same stuff everybody else is selling at a lower price, and eventually that forces prices down, and it's great. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
It's an amazing thing.
And what this textile guy explained to me is, in that model, you don't want people thinking for themselves. The last thing you want is a guy, at fiber spinning machine number 378 to think, hey, I got a great idea. I know how to do this even better. You want that guy.
You might, but it's really hard to do.
It's really hard to do. It's really expensive to have a system to learn from that person. I mean, the lean manufacturing is actually a brilliant system for doing this and saving money at it. But let's leave that aside for now, because that complicates my story in interesting ways.
No, but I think it's the right point. I think it's going on. It's just not going to be done by the person who's working the machine often, even though Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations talks about the person with the machine having an idea on how to make it better. But that was okay in 1776, but by 1976, that was a very specialized task already, improving the machine. And that's not going to happen from the people who work on the line most of the time.
Exactly. And so you have, in extreme form, you have, Taylorism and an absolute obsession with every body movement, et cetera. I think, we pretty quickly learned that was too extreme. But basically, you want consistency, you want predictability, and you want to know that if Frank is sick, we can put Bill in, and he'll do the job just as well as Frank would. That there are clear work rules, there's clear expectations, and you want people not to know that much about the market signal. You don't want them responding on a moment-by-moment basis to cotton prices or fiber prices or sweater prices or whatever it is, your costs and your revenue. It's just not important for them to know. But today, that commodity level business is, there are companies in America that do it. We actually, we do have a lot of fiber spinning operations that export yarn to China. So we are competitive in it, but that's a tough way to go. And it involves massive capital expense. You have to just stay on top of the absolute latest in machinery. And that's a tough way to go, commodities. But a much better way to go is to have some high value added premium on top of your product so that you're not in a commodity price competition race. And again, this can be misunderstood as talking in extremes, because obviously costs and prices, the price you charge and the price you have to pay, both are important in any business. But the emphasis, I think today, the core thrust of American business is no longer as much on the production side, on getting your costs down, but on the added value side, getting the price you can charge up by creating a product that people value more than any other product. So you're not in a price competition. And that turns out to be really a totally different challenge that requires a system that is receiving signals from the market in a continuous way and coming up with creative solutions. It just requires more people, more brain power, more and more just you want that system to be really sensitive to the market.
Yeah,
so another thing I think about is ivory soap. So like up until the 1870s or so, for the most part, soap is this horrible thing that you make, like your mom makes out back with the fat from the pig your dad slaughtered, and it has gristle and it rots in the sun and stinks, and suddenly there's ivory soap, which is not great soap. It's actually pretty awful soap. It dries your skin. It's not a particularly nice soap, but it doesn't have gristle.
Yeah.
It doesn't take a lot of time. It doesn't stink on a hot day in the summer. And so for like 100 years, it's the soap for everybody. It's exactly wrong for everybody, but it's better than the alternative. Today, there's so many soaps. I mean, there's an explosion of soaps, and there's an explosion in technology. I mean, the chemicals inside of soaps. There's such a range of possibilities that soap designers have at creating new soaps and new feelings and new scents and new everything, that you want to really know a specific subgroup of people. What do they care about? What do urban women in their 40s want to feel in a soap? And what do hip kids in their, who are 17, what do they want? And, what do elderly people in an old age home, what do they want? And that requires
what a strange world it is when my teenage sons leave their body wash in my shower and I mistakenly use it. It's a frightening,
right, exactly.
It's a frightening thing. And I walk down the street and I won't tell you what happens. It's just to say it's dangerous. Sorry, I couldn't resist.
Yeah, exactly.
I try to stay away from it. It smells different. It's not for me.
Yeah,
pheromones and
And so the way I think about it is you're injecting the market more deeply into your business, into your product development, product manufacturing, your production. And I always use manufacturing as a metaphor just because it's easier to picture. But I think this is actually even more so in services. I mean, I've spent time with accountants, with lawyers, with doctors who are, and medicine is its own problem, obviously, but who are trying to think about what is the service people want. Nobody wants a tax return. That's not something anyone wants. It's something you have to pay for. But what advice, what help do you want to think about money, and how can I add to that? How can I, as an accountant, add more value? So I think about that constantly as a journalist. I feel like I'm getting more market signals today than I did when I started 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I lived in a broadcast world where I was one of dozens of, hundreds of reporters who were producing content for a radio station. We didn't really know what people listened to. We didn't really know what they liked or didn't like. I didn't know what I personally was adding. But now I live in a world of podcasting and Twitter and online commentary, and I know, believe me, I know day by day, week by week, I know how many people listen and read. I know what they like and what they don't like. I'm getting tons of market signals all the time.
So I just want to push back a little bit. I think what you're talking about is an incredibly important part of the change the economy, and it has implications we're not going to get into, unfortunately, because we're running short on time. But there are obviously implications for a premium that's placed on creativity and flexibility, responsiveness, and we're not the first people to notice that life's a lot harder for people who aren't well educated. It seems to have gotten a lot harder because some of the kinds of jobs you're talking about just aren't there anymore, and our education system's not very responsive to that. And we did it, I think, in our last episode that we talked a lot about that. It's obviously a related issue. But it seems to me that on the commodity argument, what you're really saying is that the value-added part, which of course it's not just coming from the supply side, it's also coming from the demand side. As we get wealthier, we want more choice. We want something more tailored to our interests. So one way to think about this is it's all about customization. It's how do we figure out ways to give our customers what they want by either making different types of products or allowing them to use the products in ways that they can tailor themselves to their own desires. And this is the dynamism of the last 20 years. It just exploded. So that is undeniably true, I think. What's not obviously true is that that's mainly on that seems to me mainly on the output product side. Question is, why is it going to be the case, if indeed it will be, that on the employment side, the input side, the workforce side, that workers then, because of that transformation towards value-added and customization, will tend to be more project-based, more – in other words, obviously, Procter & Gamble is going to have – if you're in the soap business today, if you're in the software business today – you're going to have a very creative, specialized team. But when Apple, creates a new product, Johnny Ive is still the guy, and has been the guy for a while, who figures out what its look and feel is. Steve Jobs didn't hire a different product design guy, even though each product coming out was very different. They had an in-house team. So you're arguing, which is fascinating to think about, you're arguing that it's more likely that people are going to come together for shorter-term projects because of the economy of the future. And I see it right now It's more, again, of a transaction cost driven side, that it's cheaper to put that team together. It's not obvious to me that they're going to be more effective in creating the output side. Do you want to think about that? Comment on it?
Yeah. And this is a big, tough area, and it's, I would say a lot of the data is against me. I mean, so, actually tenure at firms.
It's early.
Is right. I mean, that's basically what I think. Is I feel, like the characters in The Big Short. I feel like I see something coming before some other people see it. That's how I feel. But that means there's a very good chance I'm completely wrong. Right. But in a backward-looking way, tenure at firms has increased. People, part of that is demographics. People are just older. But the average length of time of working is longer than it was in the 20th century. Firm size is, really large. New entrant firms is shockingly slow to grow. I mean, we have this entrepreneurship deficit. It just stays flat even as population grows, around 400,000 new firms a year. Now, I would point out, we're not very good at measuring what that means. I mean, a lot of those are, mom and pop grocery stores or whatever, and not
going to hire a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, like, the day Google opened, it was just one firm out of 400,000. And so anyway, but broadly speaking, we clearly have not yet completely tipped into the world I'm describing. I think what I see as highly likely is something of a barbellification, that there are certainly huge industries where economies of scale are only going to get more valuable. And the iPhone really is a singular product, and Apple is a singular company in which creating a product that everybody, one product that everybody loves that's a tricky thing. And if everyone can do that, great, but not everyone can do that. But I certainly think, there's lots of places where economies of scale are only going to increase. I mean, Google, Amazon, we're seeing it in healthcare, banking. But I also expect there to be enormous growth on the small and intimate side of the scale, where people are able to profit from more intense, deeper interactions with their customers. I mean, an example I'd give is my buddy Alex Bloomberg and his new podcasting company Gimlet, and he's been very public about this because he has this great podcast startup. He has a podcast company that reaches a tiny fraction of the audience he was able to reach when he was working. He and I created Planet Money together. So when he was working on Planet Money, so he's reaching far fewer people, but I can tell you he's bringing in a lot more revenue. And that's because he's creating content that has a level of passionate engagement that's reflected in what companies are willing to pay for advertising and kind of the buzz he gets, et cetera. And there's a guy in my book, an accountant who's a really interesting guy who used to be kind of a standard CPA who had hundreds of clients who he would do taxes for. And then he decided to throw that model away and basically become a much more deeply trusted advisor for 40 people. And he makes a lot more money providing a highly valued suite of services for 40 people than he did doing basic accounting functions that software can do for hundreds of people. Right. And so I just don't know how to see the future without seeing a lot more of that. People finding intimate, passionate engagement with their customers in a way that requires, in unsexy language, a sensitivity to market signals that, fuels every aspect of an organization. So that's my intuition. That's what feels like that's going to be more and more. Now, whether that's 8% of the workforce or 20% of the workforce, it's certainly not going to be 100% of the workforce. But what I do feel quite strongly is people who listen to EconTalk, who listen to NPR, who read the New York Times, people who are educated, who have curiosity and ambition, this is something to look at carefully. This is a real opportunity and something to pay a lot of attention to. I do have blue collar family who didn't go to college. Some of them didn't graduate high school. I don't think I'm going to tell them, hey, you should become a value added entrepreneur who's constantly shifting jobs. I don't think that's good advice for them. But I do think there are people for whom this is a model that you should be prepared for and even excited about.
So I want to close with some of that downside, and I would put my own optimistic spin on it and get your reaction. A lot of people are critical of the rise of companies like Uber, where their workforce is essentially piece workers, workers who are paid they don't earn an annual salary. They're paid a commission if they can get a ride, if they can get a passenger, if they can take someone somewhere, and they don't have long-term promises about necessarily benefits. They have to provide their own car or pay for their own gas, insurance. And a lot of people are very critical of that. And my answer to that always is, well, how do they get people to do it if it's so awful? And I think that's really important. But I want to say something slightly more optimistic about it, which is a lot of people like Uber, working for Uber, or I bet they like working on this Hollywood project for 6 months, because when it's over, they can take a month off or a week off. A lot of the people I talk to who drive for Uber, and of course, my kids tease me all the time that I always talk to them because I'm interested in it. A lot of them are entrepreneurs. They're waiting for their funding to come through. They're waiting for something to happen, and they might work 80 hours a week while they're waiting. And when the money comes through or when their idea starts to click, they're going to work 5 hours a week, and then they'll just stop. And they don't owe any loyalty to anyone. They can move in and out of work as they choose. And I think there's a large group of people who really love that. And that's a feature for many people, not a bug. And what matters is your satisfaction and how rewarding your life is emotionally in that world. Your financial part of it depends on what you make while you're working. And it's true it's only sort of part-time, but if you make enough, and evidently many Uber drivers are former taxi drivers who make more money with Uber, for example, if you make enough, it's great. And so it seems to me that, to move more generally to your point, that if we move to a world where people are essentially their own company, their own brand, the captain of their own ship rather than an employee, there are many good things about that as long as they have the skills that are in demand that people are willing to pay for. Many people, unfortunately, will not have those skills. That is a serious issue. But for many people, those are enormous pluses, not minuses.
Yeah, yes, I agree with you. And thinking of life as an Uber driver where that is your only possible source of income, I would guess that might be tough. I mean, that I would expect, and with driverless cars, et cetera, price competition is not going to be your friend. But thinking about a world where you have a whole bunch of options, including TaskRabbit and who knows what else, Airbnb, to earn money in a variety of ways that's, at various times and at various levels of intensity, that strikes me as only good. I mean, if we could shove that into the 1950s, I think you would have seen a lot more people leaving that corporate model and starting their own businesses, or maybe, spending more time doing other creative endeavors. So that all strikes me as a helpful tool. It does sound like some of the people who work at Uber have kind of been jerks, and so I understand. But it does strike me as weird that we're like, some people are mad at the company that's providing this opportunity, as if, it is tough that there are lots of Americans who are underemployed and aren't earning enough. That is a bad situation, but it is confusing to me why we get mad at the companies that are providing a solution. I will say, by the way, I think we're only going to get more. I hope we only get more information. I had an Uber driver recently who I came in. She offered me snacks and water. She provided a level of service. It was really amazing. But I thought, I have no way of selecting you. All I do is order an Uber.
No, you do, though. You rate her, you give her 5 stars, and people who continually give her 5 stars make it more likely that Uber will give her the best customers. And there are other ways that market signal, I think, is working. I just have to say it's very important. When I tweeted about Uber recently, and people asked me if I had shares in the company. I don't have a financial stake in Uber. It's not some little thing where they're paying me to say nice things about them. They may not be nice people. They may be nice people. I'm not judging that. I have no idea whether they have problems, of course. What I love about Uber and Airbnb and similar companies is that they shake things up and they give consumers more of what they want. And as an economist, that's as close to lyricism as we get, other than the fact that it allows some people to flourish and get free from their cars, say. And there are some beautiful, beautiful things about that. That's what I'm excited about. I have no personal stake. I just want to say that because I forestall any emails on the topic. And if you want to make a similar disclaimer, you can
Yes,
too.
I will make a similar disclaimer. I have no shares in Uber, although I am a frequent customer and feel like I bought a car right before Uber, my first new car ever. And I think if Uber had been part of my life a month earlier, I wouldn't have bought that car. So, I do love Uber, even if I don't agree with everything everyone involved in Uber ever said.
No doubt. So I don't want to end on this Uber note. So tell me, close and talk about storytelling, because you mentioned at the end of your article that storytelling is going to be a part of the economy of the future.
So, I think overall, when I think about there's some phrases that just feel ugly, like monetizing passion or the value-added premium, that are phrases I sometimes use in describing how I think business will work increasingly in the 21st century. But I think, for me anyway, it's really about a broader storytelling, that creating products and services that fit into a person's life in a rich and intimate way, and learning how to, a phrase I sometimes think about is, people have to, in a world where you have to be more sensitive to market signals, you have to be better at articulating the value you add, that place where your passion and interest coincides with a market demand. You have to be more active. You have to, one way of saying that is you have to be a salesman or salesperson for yourself, but you have to tell stories about yourself. But you also have to be better at articulating the needs that others have in your domain. So, if you and I decided, you did direct a music video, you and I don't know what we need in costumes. We don't know what we need in set design. And part of why we're going to hire the person we hire to do that is because they're good at articulating what we need. They're good at articulating what they can give and what we need. And so, again, just using Ivory soap as a crude example, it's a fairly low bandwidth product. Here's soap. It cleans you, and it's not going to stink or ruin, it's not going to rot. But it's not really telling you much about how it will fit into your life. And by the way, I'm not talking about like some BS narrative of, this soap is, from some plant that'll make you feel like you're in the tropics and you'll be rich. And I'm sure that will continue to be an important part of advertising. But I'm talking about, a more honest, more grounded articulation. When I started researching soap, for example, I learned that there really are different soaps and they really do interact with your skin differently. And I really should know more about that. And there are products I should buy and there are products I shouldn't buy because of who I happen to be and what I care about and biology I have. And so that ability both to articulate your own value, both like moral values, but also the value you bring to the market, and being able to articulate what people in your domain want and need, I think that's increasingly going to be important. That's increasingly going to be lucrative. And so it's something people need to get better at. And so I summarize that as you have to become a better storyteller.
My guest today has been the storyteller Adam Davidson. Adam, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you, Russ. I always love it.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.